Hi everyone, it's Paige. Let me switch over so you can see me. Okay. Hi, it's Phat Tuesday. That means that I am serving up another tutorial, and today I am going to be talking to you all about Aperture in preparation for today's photography challenge. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about with the photography challenge, it is the February photo challenge, and it's a picture a day. It's a fun, stress-free way to play around with photography and really learn a lot. And if you haven't joined in, we're only 4 days in, so you're only 4 days behind, so you can jump right in, you can catch up, and certainly get started with the photography challenge. I'm going to apologize. I'm going to make myself a little smaller here, but it's very gloomy today, so I don't actually have a lot of light in my house right now, so I know I'm a little dark on your screen. So, but about the photography challenge, go on to, if you're in the VIP group, which you are if you're watching this, probably, I have a couple posts about it there. You can also look at it on Instagram in my stories. I have a highlight there that shows all of my photos that I've taken so far for the photography challenge. And then it also has the list of all of the challenges for each day. Now, today's challenge is Aperture Priority, so I'm challenging you to take a photo in Aperture Priority. So I thought in preparation for that, I would explain a little bit about what Aperture Priority is, what Aperture is, and why you would use Aperture Priority over shooting in manual or shutter priority or what have you. So to get started, I'm just going to grab my camera here. Okay. So here's my camera. So on the camera, there is a little dial. You can see here. All right. There is, okay. So there is a dial, and this has all of your camera modes. And so if you have your camera in Aperture Priority, like I do, it's usually usually that is marked by an A. So you can look at your camera manual just to make sure that the A is aperture priority, but that's what it is in mine. And so when I'm in aperture priority, what my camera does is it sets a constant aperture. So I set the aperture, and then the camera sets everything else. But before we even go into that, you might be wondering, what is aperture? So aperture is how wide your shutter is going to open. So if you think of aperture like curtains or blinds in our house, the more open they are, the more light is coming into our house. So the aperture is, the shutter is like a circular thing. So if you have your aperture closed like this, it's not letting in very much light. So you open it up and it's going to let in more light. Now, the aperture is just one part of the exposure triangle. So we have a triangle, so we have our aperture, we have our ISO, and we have our shutter. So all three of those things have to work together, but the aperture controls its own part of the exposure triangle. And that is the wideness of the shutter and how much light is coming in that way. So if we want to add more light to a picture, so if we're taking a picture and it's too dark and we want to add more light in, one way we can do that is by opening up our aperture. And that is marked by something called an f-stop. And this is the most confusing thing about aperture. So your f-stop, if it is a lower number, so f1.4 is a very wide open aperture. So what's confusing is that the lower number is a bigger opening and the larger number is a smaller opening. So if I am shooting at f1.4, my aperture is going to be like this. If I'm shooting at f11, it's going to be closed more. It's going to be like this. So that's where it gets confusing, because you would think that the bigger number would mean a bigger opening, but that's not the case. So that's probably the most confusing thing about aperture, but you get used to it. So the other thing that you want to consider is when you are making one change, so while the aperture is one thing, it also will affect your exposure. It affects the entire exposure triangle. So if you make a change to your aperture, you may also need to make a change to your shutter speed and your ISO to compensate. Because while there is each layer of the exposure triangle and it's going to do its own thing independently, they all also work together to create that exposure. So that's the other thing you have to keep in mind. The other thing that exposure kind of controls is your depth of field, or how blurry your background is going to be. So at a wider aperture, at a bigger opening with more light, you're going to have less of whatever you're taking a picture of is going to be in focus. It affects the depth of field. So if I am, so these are my two hands. Okay, so let's do it this way. So if I am taking a picture of something, I don't know, forget the hands. So if I'm taking a picture of something and I want to have a blurrier background, one way that I can control that is by shooting at a lower aperture or a more wide open aperture. Now that's not the only thing that controls depth of field. You also control it by the focal length of your lens. A longer focal length is going to create more compression, which means that you're going to have more background blur that way. And then also how close you are, how close your subject is to the background also will control that. And I don't know, I mean, this is just like so I don't know if you can see, it's not going to focus it on this. Maybe it will. But if I'm moving something closer and my camera actually focuses in on it, so right now the pen is blurry. But if it was the opposite, so as I move this back, you can see that the pen becomes more in focus. And so it's kind of like the opposite of what happens with, depending on where your focal point is falling on me. So that's kind of, I'm trying to demonstrate to you. So if I am taking a picture of something and my camera's here, okay, and my camera's here and I'm here, I might have a very blurry background, but if I move out this way, then whatever's in the background is going to become more in focus. So that's the other thing to keep in mind So shooting wide open, a lot of people want to shoot wide open and then they'll have like blurry pictures and they don't understand why. It may be that you're making your depth of field too narrow and you're not allowing all of those features to come into focus. So those are other things that you have to keep in mind. So the only way, so the aperture is not the only way to control background blur, but it is one of the ways. So aperture priority, what does that mean? So an aperture priority on my camera, like I said, if I'm putting in an aperture priority, when I let me turn on my camera. So if I'm turning my camera on and I set my camera into aperture priority, right now I have my aperture set at 1.4. So if my aperture is at 1.4, my camera is going to meter the mode and it's going to say, okay, at 1.4, to make this a perfect exposure, I need to have, let's see what it is. I don't have a card in there right now, so it won't work. It is going to make the, let me get my card here. Put this in here. All right. So if I do that, then the camera is going to determine at an aperture of 1.4 that my shutter speed needs to be 60, 1/60th of a second, and my ISO needs to be 1250. So if I were to then change my aperture and make it higher, which means that the hole is smaller and it's letting in less light, then my camera is going to determine that I need to have a shutter speed of 1/8 of a second, and my ISO needs to be 1600, but my aperture is, I took my aperture up to 5.6. Now, alternatively, so let's keep my aperture here. I'm going to take it down to 1.4 again because I'm shooting inside. So if I take a picture of my desk right here where there's some light because I have my light on, and I take a picture, but then I move over here to where there's not light behind me, and take another picture, it's going to change the settings based on how much light is available. So in the first picture I took, at an aperture of 1.4, my camera determined the ISO needed to be 1000 and the shutter speed was 1/60th of a second. In the next picture I took where I didn't have as much light, it had to bump that ISO up to 1600 and the shutter speed was 1/13th of a second, which is slower. So your camera is going to make determinations based on what that aperture is. It doesn't know what you're taking a picture of, and so it will give you the fastest shutter speed that it can by still maintaining the proper exposure. But the downside to shooting an aperture priority, if you're shooting in a low light situation versus shooting in manual, is that it may make that shutter speed so low that you're going to get motion blur because you're not going to be able to hold your camera still, unless of course you're shooting with a tripod. So I have some pictures that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to make myself smaller here, maybe. All right. I'm going to go down here to the corner. So I have some pictures that I want to show you, and this will kind of demonstrate to you kind of what I'm talking about. So I also have a bunch of other windows open that I need to kind of hide here. I can see what I'm doing. Okay. Okay, so here's a picture that I took in my house, and you can see here that I had my aperture at 1.4, which is very wide open, and you can see that only the very front part of this doll is in focus, and then the rest is like super out of focus. So that's just to kind of demonstrate what shooting wide open can kind of accomplish. This is a 16 millimeter lens, so it's a pretty wide lens, which means I'm not getting a lot of compression with my lens. So the background blur is being mostly controlled by how close this is. So my camera was pretty close to this, and then the really wide open aperture. But you can see here that the camera settings that my camera chose were ISO of 640, an f-stop of 1.4, which I chose, and then the shutter speed was 1/160th of a second. So that's what it did when I was taking the picture inside. Now when I moved outside, there was a little bit more light available to me. And you can see here that it chose an ISO of 200. Again, the f-stop was 1.4, which is what I chose, but the shutter speed was 1/640th of a second. So you can see how shooting in an aperture priority, if you're going from different types of lighting sources or anything like that, that sometimes it can be helpful because maybe you're moving from, maybe you're taking pictures outside, and sometimes, there's full shade and sometimes there's full sun, and it can be a way to kind of control the aperture and get that constant aperture without having to go into your settings and change them a lot. And then so then here was another one, another part of my house. And again, the aperture was still at 1.4, but these settings were an ISO of 200, and it brought down the shutter to 1/250th of a second, because at this part of my house, there wasn't as much sun because it's more of a shaded area. Then here on the porch where there wasn't any, here on this part of the porch where there wasn't any shade versus here. And then I also did the same thing with a higher shutter speed. So then I brought my a higher aperture. I brought my aperture up to f16. So I would have all of the dolls in focus, and my camera at f16, it took the ISO up to 1600, and the shutter speed was 1/30th of a second. So, and I think, but here this is the same area, but with the shutter at 1.4, the aperture at 1.4, sorry. It had the ISO at 200 and the shutter speed at 1/400th of a second. So, the other thing that I want you to see is my aperture is staying constant because I'm shooting an aperture priority, but but you can see that the ISO and the shutter keep changing to compensate to get that exposure right in the middle. And when I'm talking about the exposure in the middle, I'm talking about your meter and your camera. And I don't know if you will be able to see the meter here, but let me bring myself up here. Sorry. Hello again. All right. So you can see here, and let me put my hand over here so you can see. Okay. All right. There we go. Okay. So right here is the right there. Whoops. Now it's taking a picture of my hand, and this isn't very in focus. Okay. So this little thing along the bottom here, this little it has like the line. If your arrow is in like right in the center of the line, then that's what your camera meter is reading as perfect exposure. Now that is going to change based on like how you were metering, but that's kind of a discussion for another day, metering modes and stuff. But when I was taking my pictures, I was using spot metering. So what it was metering to make the exposure, let me bring myself down again. So when I was using spot metering, it was metering right here. And, sorry, I don't think you can see what I'm doing. Okay. So I was using spot metering. So it was metering right in the area of this little doll to meter the exposure for the doll, not the rest of the scene. So the default on your camera is going to be like, where it meters everything. And so it'll meter the entire screen, or, like the entire field of view, and so you will get different results on that. So I was using spot metering, so that's why this is like perfectly exposed, but you could almost say like maybe the background is a little underexposed. But I can fix that in post. I could go here and, boost this a little bit, or go into Photoshop and fix it that way. So I could, boost that a little bit, go into Photoshop and, add a, whoops, can't see my microphone, boost the background, and then, paint it off of here. So I could do that to adjust it, but, thought it was better to have the product well exposed. All right. So, so that's Aperture and Aperture Priority. So I hope that this helps you, and I hope it gives you some ideas for when you're shooting, an Aperture Priority today. If you have any comments or questions or anything at all, go ahead and post them in the comments. I'll be posting this to YouTube a little bit later, so if you want to share the video or rewatch it, you can watch it on YouTube. If you haven't yet, make sure that you join the Phat Tuesday Club. And it is the first Tuesday of the month, so there's going to be an extra special goodie for you there. And it's a free club. You can join it on my website, www.thephatphotog.com. And I will be back next week for another free tutorial. See you guys later. Bye.